Hey there, Argumentation students. Hi. Hello. And everyone who's watching this video, I don't know why you would be if you're not an Argumentation student, but anyway, welcome. This is a tough talk to give because this is the one reading that the students are always like, we don't want this reading. This is terrible. I don't understand it. And I've given talks on it before. There's other videos on it, I think, here on the channel. But I thought I would try a new one just to kind of orient it in a different way and kind of try to make the video less than half an hour, which is hard to do. And this video is about debunking and argumentation, which is Kenneth Burke's essay, The Virtues and Limitations of Debunking. So understanding debunking, you have to understand a little bit about Kenneth Burke. And what Burke is interested in is how to understand that people are always flexible. That is, that when we think of people as being a certain way, that's less them being that way in a natural state or a internal kind of state than us assigning that identity to them based on how we interpret their motives through their actions, through how they do their actions, through where we see them, and through how they communicate their purposes and what they're up to. And they do this in different ways. People will say one thing and do another, and you say, what are they up to? And Burke says this is the root of understanding human behavior. And he calls it, there's several terms that are important for Burke. Motive, attitude. Now those are in relationship. So once you feel like you have somebody's motive, then you can have an attitude about them. And Burke says motives correspond with attitudes. Now, this is very different in argument where we're like, that person is wrong. That person is bad. That person is evil. Burke would say, well, not in a totalizing sense. That's the attitude you have based on what you see the motives are. So this opens up a lot of possibility for error on our side. It also opens up the idea that everything we see about the world and about people and about the things they're doing is an interpretation. And one of the things about argumentation I think is quite powerful is how it forwards interpretation as the first step before you can get to some kind of truth. And interpretation is always faulty. It's always has an element of wrongness in it. Now that doesn't mean your interpretation can't be good, but it can always be reversed. It can always be changed. It's not a commitment that is immutable. The other thing about Burke is this idea of identification and division. So we're always trying to identify with sets of motives that we think are positive, that we want other people to associate us with. The kind of clothes you wear, how you style your hair, things like that, but also how you speak and what kind of things you associate with. If you think of social media, this is a great example of identification. How you pose yourself, what's in the background. And we think about this a lot in the pandemic with Zoom calls. Where do people put their camera? Like I put it over here because the light comes through the window here and I think it looks better. But I put all these little Minecraft guys over here because I kind of want to be identified with Minecraft, which I think is really cool. And I had some Doctor Who stuff around, but it's kind of like I had to move it out of the way. But this is identification. And when you identify, you divide with contrary motives. So if I say something like Bernie Sanders is really cool, I'm probably automatically, to people hearing that, dividing myself from Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, etc. So with those things in mind, let's get into the debunking article. And I wanted to let you have a look. Oops, sorry. I have my microphone a little too low there. I want you to take a look at the man himself. Here's Kenneth Burke in his study in New Jersey, near the end of his life. Wonderful picture. He's typing away on the typewriter. Kind of wish we still did that. Typewriters are kind of cool. Maybe I'm like a hipster for saying that, but I think it's kind of cool. So here's the way to think about this essay, and I'm going to take you through kind of the way. I would still suggest you read it. You got to read it, but maybe this will help you understand what you're reading, because Burke, he writes in a way to where he just really doesn't care that much about you. He's like, this is how it's coming out. It's kind of weird, right? he's like writing in this very complex way that requires several different kinds of reading. So hopefully I can orient you to this, because this is a very important essay for argumentation. So what is debunking? It's reducing all human behavior to the worst elements as a starting point. And what it sounds like rhetorically is people are basically evil. People are basically selfish. Or people are basically buy low, sell high, or whatever the case may be. It's the reduction of human, and this is what we see in almost every popular book these days about human nature, isn't it? We always see books that are like, well, here's the problem with people. Here's what's wrong with them. Here's what people are basically like, and it's just reductive. And Burke is not interested in reductiveness. Burke thinks that reductiveness is how we go to war. So if we reduce people to their worst elements, then they're not really people worth saving. We can go to war. And his whole project, in the front of his books, he put ad bellum purificandum, which in Latin means towards the purification of war. War by other means, through language. If we thought of war as a deep dive into our motives and an attribution of attitudes for motives, then we would have a better, well, maybe not a better world. There'd still be a lot of hostility and trouble and pain and suffering and stuff, but we wouldn't be killing people. If you think about the recent Syrian airstrikes and things like that. So debunking is when you argue so effectively that there's no place to bring in any redeeming quality from that. And you've eliminated the grounds for advancing your position by taking apart the other side. And the example he uses for this is that there's no logical place to, it's just kind of desperate. There's no solution available because you have taken away any kind of ability or any kind of attitude that would allow you to come up with a contrary position. So, the example he gives is that matches cause a house fire. So what we need to do is ban matches. And so, but matches are kind of useful. Maybe there might be a more moderate way that we can deal with it. So you prevent, this is his quote, if you prevent misuse by preventing use, then that's what debunking is. And then you have to covertly reintroduce what you overtly excluded. So his example is you want to ban matches, but then you suggest lighters because they're childproof. But you're really suggesting the same thing, just in a modified kind of way. The danger of this is that it forwards vengeance on people who disagree with you, but it doesn't allow a lot of space for your allies or for solutions that, I mean, it's very pleasurable to argue like this, isn't it? There is no positive thing. I mean, we see this in social media all the time, right? I don't know who needs to hear this, but, or if you are a person who says X, unfollow, right? And it's this totalizing kind of argument where there's no position to say, well, maybe there is something redeeming about the discourse. Maybe there is an element in there that would provide a better perspective on it, It's misleading. It's too messy to talk about motives, Burke says. That's why people argue like this. People argue like this because it's very messy to be like, well, what are the possible motives involved? But for us in argumentation, that's the heart, in my opinion, that's the heart of the art of argumentation, and why it's so beautiful. Is because it's messy and it's about perspective. So he has this great paragraph in the essay about how sometimes you go up the street to catch the bus, but if the weather is bad, you go down the street to catch the bus. And from the debunking point of view, you'd be like, look at the contradiction. You went up the street one day and down the next. Is contradictory, but the conditions are what's left out of most contradictory arguments, situation and circumstance. So to argue effectively, instead of debunking, which is this kind of absolutist winner-take-all cutthroat mode of arguing, we have to think about situation, and we have to think about the possible motives they might have, not the ones that immediately identify to us who they are conclusively. We need to have a little space. There's a weird thing Burke talks about. He calls the humanitarian afterthought. And this is great because this is like all journalism and what all these books do, which is they talk about how incredibly impossible it is, how totalizing it is that these people are this way. Like people are immutably criminals. But then they'll have a chapter in the book at the end being like, well, maybe if we could just teach them how not to be. It's like, bro, you just said people are this way. They weren't taught how to be. They just are this way. And the humanitarian afterthought is like, well, maybe one day if we keep the faith, people will get better. And that's not really much of a solution, but this is what debunking allows the only solution to be, is to say, well, we just need more education. Instead of, let's look at all the possible motives for why they're doing what they're doing. And you can think immediately of the application of this to our largest governmental and social problems here in the United States, can't you? When you think of things like healthcare, welfare reform, the military, education funding, things like that are common places where people make debunking arguments. So what would happen if we were to move away from debunking and have an argument theory that was more like, let's look at all the motives, and when someone says, we need a border wall, instead of calling them evil or anti-human and saying that's what they are, it's just evil fascists, what might be the locus of motives there that they're talking about? And our attitude can be controlled. And you can think through that and say, well, maybe there might be something redeeming about having a coherent, strong immigration policy. Whatever that might mean to you. So that's just one example you can think of how powerful this could be. So instead of thinking that your opponent's argument is irrational or outside the bounds of logic, which often people do in argument, what's wrong with just saying somebody's wrong? Now, we're going to get to this in a later argument, in a later unit, where we're going to talk about fallacies and the problem of fallacies. Fallacies are extremely problematic. Fallacies are like taking your kid to karate class and then they come home and kick everything. They kick the cat. Look, I can do this high kick. It's amazing. They feel empowered. They want to use it all the time. It's the same thing with fallacies. Once you learn the fallacies, you feel powerful. But the fallacies can be debunking mode too. They can be used as debunking as well. That's an ad hominem. You're done. I can't listen to you anymore. That's a post hoc. That's a petitio. Like they're kind of used in this totalizing, scorched earth way, which Burke says, well, maybe not. Maybe there's space in there for the redemptive counter-argument, because argument is about correction or alteration of views, not about proving who's right and wrong, which is a big change from the way most people think about argument, isn't it? Let's look at some questions that I want you to think about when you're reading, and maybe you can incorporate some of these questions in your unit assignment. What can be done to intervene in debunking? How can we teach people how not to do this? I mean, it does seem like there's a risk in there that Burke is saying, well, this is how people argue, and he might be engaging in a little debunking himself, but he avoids it pretty carefully by saying, look, I mean, let's just not do this. There's an alternative. But the joy of debunking, the joy of being right, might be something that we might not want to debunk, but maybe retread or reinterpret in a way. Can you address debunking critically without performing it? Just talked about that. What does political argument look like if arranged around interests and motive? Instead of you're right, you're wrong, you hate working people, you love rich people, instead of this kind of address of public issues, what happens if we talk about interests and motive? What are the motives of the party opposite me? What are the interests? Maybe those motives aren't so bad. Maybe my attitude is bad. Maybe there's a way I can find something redemptive there. Another thing to address, how does social media play into debunking? That would be the Jaron Lanier book that you're all supposed to be reading. Some of you are really into it. Some of you haven't mentioned it at all, so I'm a little worried. Don't get too into it. Don't replace your social media addiction with an addiction to Lanier's book, and don't ignore it completely. And then the other thing is in the Citizen book by Claudia Rankine, what's an alternative to debunking? Is her work guilty of doing some debunking, or does she offer a solution to debunking through her brilliant book? What do you think? I mean, there might be some debunking elements there. I'm curious to see what you think. That might be an approach you can make to using this. So I hope this video has helped you understand Burke's idea of debunking. It's when you call your opponents irrational, illogical, stupid. There's nothing about what they're saying that could possibly make sense. Or is it there's something wrong with how they're interpreting the motives, the situation, the scene, or something wrong with how we're interpreting their motives, and there might be some redemptive place. If we go into the murk, instead of just throwing the murk away, we might actually find a place for a better approach to argumentation that really does kind of address that kind of violent path we seem to be on with argument, where there's no reason to argue anymore. If I know what's right, I can just attack you.